What happens to a person who believes they are the sun when the world suddenly stops orbiting them? This singular moment of being ignored creates a psychological vacuum that feels more like a physical strike than a silence. It is a subtle, yet devastating experience that reveals the hidden architecture of the human ego in its most vulnerable state. We often observe individuals who command every room with an air of absolute certainty and unshakable, performative self-confidence. They seem to possess a gravity that pulls others in, yet this power relies entirely on the active participation of an audience. When that audience withdraws their gaze, the charismatic individual does not simply become quiet. They often begin to psychologically unravel. Their composure gives way to a frantic, restless energy that seeks any form of validation, even if that validation is negative. The gap between their projected image and their internal reality becomes a widening chasm that they struggle to bridge with words. It is a strange contradiction where those who appear the most powerful are actually the most dependent on the attention of others. The silence of a room becomes a mirror that they cannot stand to look into for more than a few moments. Gradually, we begin to wonder why the absence of a reaction causes more distress than a direct, vocalized confrontation or argument. Why does the mind perceive being ignored not as peace, but as a total erasure of the individual's social existence? This pattern suggests that for certain personalities, attention is not a luxury, but a biological and psychological necessity for survival. The mystery lies in the fragility of a self-image that requires constant, external reinforcement to remain upright and stable over time. Philosophers and psychologists have long noted that the human sense of self is a social construct that requires external mirrors. Arthur Schopenhauer observed that we often treat the opinions of others as our most precious possession, even when those opinions are hollow. He suggested that the ego is a beggar, perpetually knocking on the doors of others to ask for a sense of worth. This insight reveals that the big ego is often a hollow shell, filled only by the reflected light of public approval. Thinkers like Friedrich Nietzsche believed that the need to be seen is a manifestation of a weak will to power. Those who cannot validate themselves from within must become parasites of the collective gaze to maintain their internal sense of reality. It is a hidden mechanism that many experience as a drive for success, but which functions as an escape from anonymity. The anticipation of being understood or admired creates a psychological high that makes the subsequent silence feel like a brutal withdrawal. We are entering the core of a behavioral loop where the mind prioritizes being noticed over being respected or even loved. This psychological journey requires us to dismantle the very foundations of how the mind perceives its own importance in the world. The core of this mechanism begins with a process called externalized self-validation, where the ego abdicates its role to the environment. Sigmund Freud might describe this as a narcissistic regression, where the individual remains stuck in a stage of primary infantile self-absorption. In this state, the brain's reward system becomes hyper-attuned to social cues, specifically those that signal admiration or high social status. When these cues are present, the brain releases dopamine, reinforcing the behavior that led to the attention in the first place. However, when the cues are removed, the mind enters a state of ego depletion, a term often explored in modern behavioral science. The individual feels a loss of agency, as if their very identity is dissolving because it is not being witnessed by others. To prevent this dissolution, the mind triggers a series of defense mechanisms designed to reestablish the individual's presence in the social sphere. These mechanisms often bypass the rational prefrontal cortex, leading to impulsive, loud, or even aggressive behaviors intended to break the silence. The ego interprets being ignored as a narcissistic injury, a literal wound to the psyche that demands an immediate, visceral response. Robert Greene, in his studies of social dynamics, notes that the greatest fear of the powerful is to become invisible or irrelevant. The mind employs a mental shortcut known as the availability heuristic, where it judges its worth based on immediate, visible social feedback. If the feedback is absent, the mind concludes that the individual has lost their power, triggering a state of high-alert anxiety. This leads to a paradox where the individual tries harder to be noticed, which often pushes people further away, increasing the isolation. The brain cannot distinguish between a lack of attention and a social death sentence, leading to a state of emotional panic. It is a reflexive process that happens beneath the level of conscious awareness, making it difficult for the individual to control. They do not choose to be bothered by the silence. Their biology demands that the silence be filled with their own name. The result is a personality that is perpetually on edge, constantly scanning the environment for any sign of a waning or flickering interest. In modern life, this behavior is frequently seen on social platforms where the like count serves as a digital heartbeat for the ego. An individual posts a curated image and then checks their phone every few seconds, experiencing a physical drop in mood if reactions lag. The absence of a comment is interpreted not as a lack of interest, but as a deliberate and personal act of social hostility. In the professional workplace, it is the manager who interrupts a productive silence to remind everyone of their own past achievements or status. They cannot allow the work to speak for itself, because if they are not the center of the dialogue, they feel redundant. In romantic relationships, this manifests as a partner who creates a crisis the moment their significant other focuses on a personal hobby. The crisis is not about the issue at hand, but about reclaiming the attention that has been stolen by an outside interest. We see it in conversations where one person constantly pivots the topic back to themselves, regardless of the relevance to the current theme. They treat the dialogue not as an exchange, but as a stage where the other person is merely a prop or a lighting technician. When the technician stops working, the actor feels the darkness closing in and begins to perform even more theatrically to stay visible. The digital age has created a theater of performative existence, where the act of living is secondary to the act of being seen. This creates a generation of egos that are broad but shallow, unable to survive the quiet of a room without a screen. The modern world rewards the loudest voice, which further reinforces the psychological belief that invisibility is the ultimate form of failure. We are losing the capacity for solitary contentment, a state that philosophers once viewed as the highest form of human intellectual achievement. Instead, we are building a society of mirrored selves, where we only exist if our reflection is being watched by a stranger. Beneath the surface of this need for attention lie deeper patterns of perceptual bias that distort the individual's view of reality. The big ego often suffers from the spotlight effect, a psychological phenomenon where one believes they are being watched more than they are. When they are ignored, this bias is inverted. They believe the silence is a deliberate, coordinated attack rather than a simple lack of focus. This leads to a state of hypervigilance, where every social interaction is audited for its potential to validate or invalidate the ego. Daniel Kahneman's work on System 1 thinking suggests that these emotional reactions are fast, instinctive, and incredibly difficult to override with logic. The individual feels the sting of being ignored long before they can tell themselves that it doesn't actually matter in the long run. Confidence is often misunderstood in these cases. It is not a solid foundation, but a fragile high-stakes gamble that must be won daily. Knowledge and competence are used as ego armor, meant to protect the individual from the terrifying possibility of being seen as ordinary. When someone ignores this armor, the individual feels exposed and naked, as if their deepest insecurities have been laid bare to the world. Power, for the ego-driven mind, is a zero-sum game. If someone else is getting the attention, they feel they are losing their own light. They lack internalized permanence, the ability to feel valuable even when no one is around to vocalize that value to them directly. This leads to a pattern of attention-seeking escalation, where the individual becomes increasingly provocative to ensure they are never forgotten. Carl Jung spoke of the persona as the mask we wear, but warned that when the mask becomes the self, we lose our soul. The big ego is a mask that has grown too heavy, and the silence of others threatens to pull that mask off and show the emptiness. This fear of the void is what drives the restless search for fame, status, and the constant noise of a crowded and busy social calendar. The mind treats every quiet moment as a memento mori, a reminder that one day they will be forgotten by the world forever. To handle being ignored would require facing this mortality, a task for which the big ego is fundamentally and tragically unprepared. They become trapped in a feedback loop of irrelevance, where their desperation to be seen makes them increasingly unappealing to others. The more they demand the spotlight, the more the audience retreats, creating a cycle of isolation that they cannot understand or break. The brutal realization is that most people with big egos are not intentionally trying to be manipulative or overbearing in their actions. They are simply limited by a psychological ceiling that prevents them from understanding that their value is independent of the crowd's noise. The mind protects its identity by creating a narrative where the world is wrong for ignoring them, rather than reflecting on the self. It is a form of perceptual blindness, where the individual cannot see the beauty of a quiet life because they are blinded by their own glare. We often assume they are arrogant, but beneath that arrogance is a profound and terrifying lack of a stable, internal home. They are refugees of their own self-esteem, constantly seeking asylum in the hearts and minds of people who are busy with their own lives. The human mind is designed to protect its beliefs, and for the ego-driven, the belief that they are special is the only thing keeping them afloat. To be ignored is to be told that you are common, a realization that feels like a death to a mind that has built a palace of exclusivity. They are often not aware of how much energy they expend trying to be the most important person in every room they happen to enter. Instead, they are only aware of the exhaustion and the bitterness that sets in when the world fails to recognize their perceived greatness. Highlighting this to them often fails, as the mind perceives the critique as another form of invalidation to be avoided or attacked. The brutality of the realization is that they are their own jailer, locked in a cell of their own making that is covered in mirrors. Until they can learn to sit in the dark without a mirror, they will never be truly free from the whims of a fickle and changing public. This brings the focus back to you, the observer, who has likely felt the pressure of these personalities in your own professional or personal life. How much of your own peace have you sacrificed to feed an ego that can never be truly satisfied or filled to the top? Do you notice the moments when you feel a similar pull to be noticed, even if it's just a small flicker of the same psychological flame? Every human mind has a seed of this ego-driven hunger, because we are social animals who evolved to survive through the group's acceptance. Introspection is the process of recognizing that your value is a quiet, steady hum, rather than a loud, discordant scream for attention. Ask yourself if you can handle the silence of a room without feeling the need to fill it with your own accomplishments or stories. To examine your own thinking is to realize that the most powerful form of confidence is the one that requires no witnesses to exist. We must ask why we are so bothered by those who demand the spotlight, and if we are perhaps bothered because we wish for it too. True freedom is the ability to walk through a crowd and feel perfectly content being absolutely and totally anonymous to everyone there. When we stop seeking our reflection in the eyes of others, we find that our internal world is far more interesting than any social stage. The escape from the trap of the big ego begins with the radical act of embracing the ordinary and finding the gold within the common. The antidote to the fear of being ignored is the cultivation of a quiet, unshakable, intellectual humility that values truth over status. Humility is not thinking less of yourself. It is thinking of yourself less, allowing the world to exist without you being the center of it. By practicing intentional anonymity, we learn that the world does not collapse when we stop trying to hold it up with our own hands. When we are content to be ignored, we gain a power that no one can take away, because no one gave it to us in the first place. This awareness leads to deeper, more authentic relationships that are based on mutual discovery rather than mutual performance or validation. We find that the most profound connections are made in the quiet moments when the masks are down and the stage is empty and dark. The human condition is a journey from the loud noise of the ego to the quiet, steady peace of the integrated and whole self. Marcus Aurelius suggested that you have the power to withdraw into yourself whenever you desire. It is there that you find true tranquility. The silence that once felt like a vacuum becomes a vast, open space where you are finally free to breathe without the weight of an audience. Reflect on the moments when you felt invisible and realize that in those moments, you were actually the most free you have ever been. The big ego is a loud, distracting detour on the path to a meaningful life, and the cure is simply to stop and listen to the quiet. Consider what might happen if you stopped performing for the world and started living for the person who exists when no one is watching. Share your thoughts in the comments below, for in the shared silence of this community, we find the truth that words often obscure.